So you may have heard bodybuilders say that in order to build muscle, you need to focus on time under tension. But what is time under tension, and is it really that important for building muscle? Well, in this video, I'm gonna talk about what exactly time under tension is, and then I'm gonna go into the common myths associated with time under tension that might actually be limiting your gains. So by the end of this video, you will not only know how important time under tension is for building muscle, but you're gonna know how to actually maximize muscle growth in a practical way. So let's get into it. So first off, there are two definitions of time under tension. There's the direct definition, which is simply the duration a muscle group experiences tension during resistance training. Then there's the second definition, which is time under tension style training, which is where you try to maximize TUT by voluntarily slowing each rep down. So now that we understand what time under tension and time under tension style training is, let's go into the common myths associated with time under tension. But real quick, if you're looking for high quality gym wear at a pretty affordable, decent price, I highly recommend you check out my clothing sponsor, Able. They recently had a new drop with a bunch of different colors. You've pretty much seen me live in their oversized hoodies as well as sweats. So definitely check that out and consider using code PATH for an extra 10% off. It will be much appreciated. Back to the content. Myth number one is because you get a better pump with TUT style training, that automatically means time under tension equals more muscle growth, right? Now, the pump is almost synonymous with TUT style training. And in fact, slowing down the reps will in fact give you a better pump and have you quote unquote feel the muscle better. But I guess the bigger myth here is that the pump is not necessarily indicative of more muscle growth. Let me explain. Well, sure, there is some correlation between you getting a pump and muscle growth. Since if you're getting a pump in the target muscle group, well, that is a surefire sign that you're actually training that muscle group properly and not something else. I want you to do a thought experiment here. Imagine doing a set of 100 reps with 5 pounds. By the end of this set of 100 that I'm about to do at 5 pounds, I'm probably gonna have some sort of pump. But was this really the best approach for a set if I'm trying to maximize muscle growth? Or am I better off working at a lower rep range, being able to hit failure sooner without worrying about cardiovascular fatigue becoming an issue? Now, myth number two is that the increased blood flow from TUT style training leads to more muscle growth. Now, similar to the pump, you may have heard the myth that with more blood flow going to muscle, the muscle is able to get more nutrients somehow, and now it's gonna grow bigger than before. I must say, this is creative, but it's pretty much peak bro science and doesn't really hold up in the scientific literature. You see, it is not increased blood flow that causes muscle growth. In fact, I think now is a good time to explain the mechanism on what actually stimulates muscle growth. You see, the main driver of muscle growth is mechanical tension. Notably, mechanical tension when you're recruiting high threshold motor units. Now, these terms are gonna get a little bit technical, but I'll try to explain it as simply as I can. Now, mechanical tension is basically the tension your muscle experiences during resistance training. Now, this might sound very similar to the tension we were referring to talking about time under tension, but there's a really big but here. And that is mechanical tension is a force, so it has a magnitude. Meaning, anytime you're exerting force on exercise, that muscle is going to experience mechanical tension. But depending on how hard you need to push, how hard the lift is, how high the intensity is, the muscle will experience a different degree, a different magnitude of mechanical tension. In other words, depending on the activity you're doing, how much weight you're using, the muscle will experience mechanical tension, but it might be experiencing more or it might be experiencing less mechanical tension. Let me give you guys an example. Your calves experience mechanical tension every time you walk. Every time you take a single step, your calves are going to be experiencing mechanical tension. But your calves also experience mechanical tension every time you do 200-pound calf raises. Now let me ask you, in which activity do you think your calves will experience more mechanical tension? If you said the 200-pound calf raises, you're correct. If you said walking, you're probably joking right now. And it is this magnitude, right? This differing degree of mechanical tension experienced by the muscle depending on the activity and depending on how hard you're training that time under tension fails to account for, which I will get into more later. But first, the natural question you might be asking now is, okay, how do I maximize mechanical tension and thus maximize muscle growth? Now this part's pretty simple. The practical advice is you train the muscle as close to failure as possible, sometimes training all the way to failure. Now I say sometimes go to failure because I don't think it's realistic to train to failure every single set, because long term you're probably gonna be running into fatigue issues. Instead, try to find a balance. Train to failure as often as you can while still being able to recover completely by your next session. So let's say I'm training chest. By the next time I train chest again, I shouldn't be sore. Now the reason why I train close to failure and maximizing mechanical tension is those last few reps on a set to failure. You know how the concentric speed slows down, even though you're pressing as hard as you can, you're pushing, it just goes slow like this. That is where the muscle experiences the highest degree of mechanical tension. And this isn't to be confused with time under tension style training where you're arbitrarily going slow on purpose. No, ideally you should try to think, okay, I'm trying to be explosive as possible, but naturally as you approach failure, the concentric speed is just gonna slow involuntarily. Key word, involuntary, which I'll talk about more. Now another important concept or thing to understand are high threshold motor units. Now HTMUs, that's the abbreviations, is essentially muscle fibers that are only recruited by the muscle when a high force demand are required, when there's a high threshold required. Now to help you visualize this, Eugene Thiel made a beautiful illustration on high threshold motor units in his 1 million subscribers special. So first off, congrats Eugene to that. But it was so good that I'm actually gonna steal it. I'm giving him credit, right? So it's not too bad, I think, I would hope. So imagine I took my bicep and I chopped it, right? I just chopped it right all the way through. Now if you took that chopped bicep and you looked at it straight on, you'll be left with a cross section of the bicep. So let's call this bicep and this cross section, okay? If you look closely, you would see a bunch of small little muscle fibers. These are gonna be low threshold motor units, okay? Among these small little dots, you'll also see these bigger ones, highlighted by these circles. Now these big ones are gonna be your high threshold motor units, your HTMUs. Now from a hypertrophy perspective, like I mentioned earlier, these HTMUs will only be recruited, will only be used when there's a high enough force demand, when the threshold is high enough for them to be activated, when the threshold is met, so to speak. And that can roughly be equated by the last 5 reps before you reach failure, which can mean all 5 reps in a set of 5, or the last 5 reps in a set of 10, the last 5 reps in a set of 12, the last 5 reps in a set of 30, 40, it doesn't really matter. Well, at least technically it doesn't matter. However, there's a reason why you shouldn't be going to the super high rep ranges, notably being that external factors will start hindering your performance on those exercises the higher the reps you go. But TLDR, it is when these high threshold motor units are actually recruited and you're maximizing mechanical tension, which means practically you're just training as close to failure as possible, that you're able to maximize muscle growth. And what happens after that? I mean, a process called mechanical transduction basically takes a stimulus and turns it into a chemical signal in your brain, and that ends up initiating muscle protein synthesis, but you don't really need to know that. But something that is important to know on the nutrition side of things is you want to be eating enough protein so that your body has the resources during muscle protein synthesis so you can actually maximize muscle growth. Now with that said, this is where a high quality protein powder supplement that has been third-party tested, meaning that actually has a protein that says it does, can come in handy. Now my personal choice for a protein powder supplement is MyProtein. I've been taking them since 2016, so close to 10 years at this point in time, and that is literally why I've been sponsored by them for the past 2 years. Now if you want a big discount while supporting my page, you can use code TPATH for that huge discount. It will be much appreciated. Helps me keep these videos coming. But with that said, back to the video. Now that you understand mechanical tension, which is the main driver of muscle growth, let's get on to the third myth about time under tension. And that third myth is focusing on time under tension equals more mechanical tension. Now let's go back to the example I talked about, walking versus calf raises. Now let's measure the time under tension on both exercises. So like I mentioned, technically your calves will feel tension as you walk, thus you're accumulating time under tension during your set of walking, which for a 1 mile walk might be something like, let's say 10 minutes. So that means you're getting 10 minutes worth of time under tension in that 1 mile walk, which seems rather good, right? Now let's compare that to a set of heavy calf raises, where in a set of, let's say 15 reps, might last like 30 seconds. So if you think about it, walking had 20 times the amount of time under tension compared to the heavy calf raises. But why is it that the heavy calf raises was more productive for muscle growth? Well, the answer is because time under tension has this huge blind spot, and that is it doesn't measure the intensity of that tension. In technical terms, it doesn't account for the magnitude of mechanical tension experience. And with the knowledge I explained earlier about mechanical tension and high threshold motor units, the reason why heavy calf raises are more hypertrophic than the walking activity, despite the time under tension discrepancy, is because if you're taking a set of heavy calf raises all the way to failure or close to failure, you are maximizing the amount of mechanical tension experienced by your calves, as well as recruiting high threshold motor units, which are both going to be extremely productive for muscle growth. Compared to the other activity where you're walking a whole mile, where before your calves can actually reach failure, you're going to run into other limitations such as joint pain, ankle pain, you're just boredom. Like, it's just not a practical way to build muscle. And this is why you hear about the ideal 5 to 12 rep range for muscle growth when you're resistance training. That 5 to 12 rep range is a pretty good sweet spot where you're not doing too many reps to the point where cardiovascular fatigue starts becoming a limiting factor. But at this point, I may have left you a little bit more confused, so I'm gonna bring it full circle with these next points. So first off, I use a really extreme example, walking versus calf raises, so let me use a more realistic example comparing TUT style training with straight sets to failure. So let's compare a set of barbell bicep curls done in a time under tension style set where I'm doing a 4-second concentric followed by a 4-second eccentric versus what I deem to be an optimal training tempo, which is as fast as you can on the concentric with a 2-second eccentric. Now, you don't gotta be spot on 2 seconds. The whole idea is you're just going slow enough that you're in control of the eccentric part, but you're not overdoing it. Let's also say we're trying to match the amount of reps we're doing, so on the TUT set, you're probably gonna have to go a little bit lighter. Now, the TUT style set is gonna be less hypertrophic because of these two things. Now, first off, anytime you're voluntarily slowing the concentric phase, you're actually going to be recruiting less high threshold motor units, and the muscle isn't going to be experiencing as much mechanical tension. This is because the force demand is going to be less in the TUT style set. Because for one thing, you're using a lighter weight. But secondly, because you're putting a tempo on the concentric, you're not exerting as much force between each rep. In other words, instead of putting your full effort into a rep, you're arbitrarily slowing the concentric down, thinking, okay, am I at 4 seconds yet? 1, 2, 3. I think that's 4. Okay, now it can go down. It's just arbitrary. And also because your set is longer, you're gonna be incurring more cardiovascular fatigue in that TUT style training. In other words, you're just gonna be more out of breath. But this isn't to say that you can't build muscle doing a TUT style training, because as long as you're training close to failure, even with a TUT style set, you still should be able to see progress, especially if you're a beginner. But I'm just saying that it's not the most efficient way to go about building muscle. Meaning if we compare that TUT style set with a straight set, where I have a quote unquote optimal training tempo, being as fast as I can be on the concentric with a in control eccentric of around 2 seconds or so. Here, as I approach failure, what happens is the concentric speed will slow down, right? But it's involuntarily. I'm not intentionally trying to slow it as it'll come up. No, it's just something that naturally occurs. That is the main difference between the two. In the TUT set, I'm voluntarily slowing the concentric. In the straight set, as I approach failure, I'm involuntarily slowing the concentric. And it is only when I involuntarily slow the concentric, the muscle experiences the highest degree of mechanical tension. That is it. That's pretty much it. Now you might be thinking, what about the eccentric portion of the lift? Well, contrary to popular belief, the eccentric phase of the lift is not more hypertrophic compared to the concentric. And this has to do with the muscle experience less mechanical tension during the eccentric phase of that lift. And while a slow eccentric does cause more muscle damage, another huge myth is the idea that muscles are torn down and then built back stronger. In fact, muscle damage is a form of fatigue. The more muscle damage you have, the more it's going to hinder your performance, so the harder it is going to be for you to train at a high intensity long term, and thus it actually limits your gains. In other words, having too long of an eccentric phase on your lift might actually be limiting your gains. It's kind of like what? Instead, I like using a 2-second tempo on the eccentric, or to be more accurate, a 2 count on the eccentric phase, just so I know that I'm in control of the weight, meaning I'm able to reduce injury, and it has nothing to do with 2 seconds ideally being like really good for muscle growth or anything. The eccentric to me is more about keeping yourself safe and making sure you're actually training that target muscle group versus you trying to get more muscle gains from somehow having a slow eccentric. With that said, that was my critique on time under tension. So the final verdict, is time under tension important for maximizing muscle growth? It is not. In my opinion, there are way more important things than time under tension. Notably on the practical end, training close to failure, aiming for progressive overload, making sure you're getting enough volume in your training, making sure you're at least training every muscle group twice per week. And with that, your time will be better served. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Hit subscribe to level up your physique. And I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.